Here's the topic where it's very important when talking about managing the schedule baseline deviation. Project schedule baseline serves as the roadmap for execution. However, the real world projects rarely go exactly as planned, whether due unexpected risks or resource constraints or, let's say, external factors. The deviations can occur, and the key to successful project execution is identifying the schedule variances early, analyzing their impact, and implementing corrective measures to bring the project back on track. This video will cover the impact analysis of schedule changes to understand the deviation of the project, of the project baselines. Also, we'll look into adjust the resource allocation by optimization of the workload distribution. We'll also see how to implement recovery plans like restoring the schedule performance. First, let's start understanding the schedule or the baseline deviation. Deviation occur here when an actual progress differs from the planned progress. And the causes of these deviations can include or may include because of, let's say, scope changes like adding in new features or requirements without considering the time for these changes to be implemented. Also, the resource constraints, meaning that you have a limited availability of your skilled labor. We also have some of these technical challenges where, say, there is unforeseen complexity and development. Also, you have external dependencies, and these delays can come from suppliers or third parties who's working at your project. So, not all of these deviations are bad. Some might be necessary to improve the quality or adapting to new business needs. The key here is to evaluate their impact and take timely corrective actions to ensure the project success. Think of this case where we talked about the scope changes, where there's new features and requirements were added. So you think, if you recall, when we talked about submitting a change request to accumulate these changes and assess the impact on the time and the cost and the risks on the overall project. So you need to have a good change control process to ensure that all of these changes or scope changes does not, let's say, bring your SPI or schedule baseline, let's say, with a big deviation from the baseline. Now let's talk about an impact analysis of schedule changes. Key consideration in impact analysis. So the first step here in managing the schedule deviation is understanding its impact. Okay. Understanding the schedule deviation with its impact if the task on critical path is delayed or not. Also the project completion which is at risk. If non-critical tasks is delayed, it may have minimal impact. Think of having a thorough, let's say, impact analysis to help you as a project manager to decide the best course of action. The key consideration when doing an impact analysis when there is any changes in the schedule, you start with having a critical path analysis. And to ask this question to yourself, does the deviation affect the critical path? Also, you have this key consideration when you have resource constraints. And to answer yourself whether you have a resource constraint or not, ask yourself, can the additional resources mitigate the delay? If you, as a project manager, brought more, let's say, resources to the project, will you be able to afford these resources? Will it mitigate the delay of, let's say, having less resources? The third key consideration here when doing an impact analysis is the budget or the impact on budget. Ask yourself as a project manager, does the pledge increase the cost? And finally, you have the stakeholder expectations. You as a project manager, ask yourself, how does the deviation impact the deliverables and the stakeholder satisfaction? Based on these answers, you could identify the impact for these schedule changes, and then you can take the corrective action is that you have to do. Now let's talk about adjusting the resource allocation to minimize the delay as one of these strategies, to control the schedule and to bring back the schedule uh, on plan. And these strategies which can be used, so adjusting the resource allocation can help you as a project manager to recover the lost time, whether by reassigning the tasks or increasing the work hours or hiring an additional personals or teams or bringing in new materials. The project managers, you must balance the efficiency with the cost and team well-being. So think of these strategies to optimize the resources. First, reallocating the resources. And by, let's say, shifting the personnel to high priority tasks, you can reallocate the resources successfully. Also, increasing the work hours, but always, again, or having, let's say, increasing the work hours, also having overtime over the week, let's say, over the weekend shifts. Remember that team well being on this point. You may also, as one of these strategies to optimize the resources, is to add skilled resources, like hiring external expert to speed up the tasks. The fourth strategy here you can follow as using cross training. Cross training, it means like enabling the team members to handle multiple roles and multiple tasks, and how to make them, let's say, capable of doing that by giving them cross training. Let's take here an example of an IT project where there is a resource adjustment requirement. Let's say there is a software project faced a schedule deviation due a key developer leaving mid the project. And to mitigate the impact on the schedule, the project manager reassigned another senior developer and provided extra training to junior developers to fill the gap. This could minimize the schedule delays from 4 weeks to only 2 weeks. Now let's talk about implementing schedule recovery plans. So when a schedule deviation threatens the project deadline or impact the overall project timeline, the project manager must act quickly. Fast tracking and crashing are two common techniques, but they come with the risks, as we talked about, such as the increased cost or reduced quality. In case the increase of cost comes when you are doing crashing because you're adding extra materials or extra resources. Also, reduced quality when you're doing fast tracking because you are, let's say, working on different, let's say, tasks in parallel. So it's important to evaluate the trade-offs before implementing the recovery plan. Also, we talked about having the resequencing the activity to adjust the dependencies to optimize the execution order. So think of these schedule recovery plans and techniques to help you overcome these delays. Also, we have talked about how to use the SPI or the schedule performance index, let's say, to assess the deviation severity. When we looked at the example of having, let's say, the lower SPI or the SPI which is lower than one, which means the project is behind the schedule. Also, we talked about when saying that there's, let's say, an SPI which is greater than one, it means the project is ahead of schedule. And the example here present that we have a project where the planned value, it's 100,000 US dollars, okay, which is the planned value. When it comes to the earned value or the EV, it's equal to 90,000 US dollars. So to calculate the SPI, remember when we say that SPI means the EV divided by the PV. So let's now divide the 90,000 divided by 100,000, and the SPI here would be zero point 0.9. And zero point 0.9 SPI means that the project is behind the schedule by 10% and requires you to have a corrective action. To remind ourselves on the SPI here, we talked about the schedule performance index or SPI, which helps you to quantify the schedule deviation. If again the SPI is below one, the project is falling behind and needs a corrective action. such as fast tracking, crashing, or resource reallocation. So in our case, we have the zero point 0.9 where we have to implement one of these corrective action to bring, let's say, the project back on track. Communicating the schedule deviations to the stakeholder. This is a very important concept that you need to keep your stakeholder in the picture. Stakeholder appreciate the transparency rather than just waiting for a crisis. Project managers should communicate the deviations early and provide solutions. This helps maintaining the trust and credibility between you and your stakeholders. The best practices here you can follow to keep your stakeholders, let's say, updated and keep the communication open between you and the stakeholders. First, you need to provide a clear summary of the deviation and the reasons behind that deviation. You may also use or explain the impact on project objectives and the project, let's say, constraints. You as a project manager not only needing to present the root cause or the clear summary of the deviation or the impact, you need also to present a corrective action plans with the timelines to implement these corrective actions to bring back the project on track. You also, as a project manager, you need to set a realistic expectation for the project completion once you have more clarity on these, let's say, deviations on the project. So when you have a full picture on these deviation, how will it impact the project timeline and constraints and the project objectives? You'll be able to estimate the new, let's say, realistic expectation for the project completion. Here we have a case study where there's, let's say, managing a major schedule deviation. Let's take a scenario where a large IT system upgrade was planned for, let's say, to complete in 6 months. And due for unseen, let's say, unforeseen compatibility issues, the testing was delayed by 4 weeks. So now you are delayed by 4 weeks for implementing a large system or IT system upgrade. So 4 weeks means 1 month out of the 6 months. The recovery plans or the recovery actions here were taken is by implementing fast tracking. And how to implement fast tracking? By conducting testing parallel to final development. Also, you as a project manager have hired additional testers to speed up the quality assurance. You also have reprioritized the lower risk features for later releases. And by following these, let's say, recovery or corrective actions, the project was delivered only 2 weeks late instead of four. So it took only 6 months and a half, not 7 months. Because you remember your delay were 4 weeks. So because of implementing this corrective action, let's say the impact on the schedule only has, let's say, come into the half, let's say, impact, which is 2 weeks, not 4 weeks. So this case study highlights the importance of having quick decision making when schedule deviations occur. By implementing the fast tracking and resource adjustment, let's say the team were able to minimize the impact and deliver the project close to the original schedule. Or takeaways here on managing the schedule baseline deviation and how to deal with baseline deviation. We talked about identifying the schedule deviations early through variance analysis. It helps you to mitigate these risks more proactively. We also talked about conducting the impact analysis to understand the critical path effects and the overall project, let's say, delays. We looked also on, let's say, the fast tracking, crashing, and resource optimization to recover the time. Finally, we talked about monitoring the SPI, and we have seen one of these real-world examples to track the schedule efficiency and adjust the plan accordingly and implement corrective actions if necessary. Finally, now let's say that there's no project follows a baseline perfectly. The key to success here is proactive monitoring, quick decision making, and let's say clear stakeholder communication. By mastering these strategies, project managers can ensure timely project delivery while minimizing the schedule risks.